Well, welcome to chapter 34. Just 2 more to go. You have to have a countdown on these things, you know. As I said last time, we're all done with tenses, we're all done with moods, we're all done with cases, we're virtually done with vocabulary. Only about, 10, 15 more words to learn. So, in a sense, your Greek is set. Except for one little thing called me verbs. And I've split me verbs into 2 chapters, so we're going to be introduced to them, and we're going to look at one of them in the indicative in this chapter, and the rest of them in the last chapter in the textbook. Basically, the verbal system that you've learned so far has a name. It's called the thematic conjugation. In other words, we've learned how Greek uses words with connecting vowels, thematic vowels, connecting vowels. 2 different words for the same thing. Another way to say it is that the verbs that we've learned so far have lexical forms in omega or in omai if they're deponent, right? There actually is a second conjugation called the me conjugation. Now, don't panic. It's not like you've only learned half the verbs and now you have to learn the same amount of verbal forms all over again. The me conjugation is not that different. There are a few differences, and unfortunately you meet those differences in the present active. So when you first start seeing these forms, they look so radically different, and you go, oh, I got another 300 some odd forms to memorize. No, you don't. There are going to be some differences, and most of those differences are in the present active. But since you've been learning how verbs get put together, then what you're going to see is that me verbs in the present active, for the most part, just get put together a little differently. But it's still pretty much the same bits and pieces. So, all that to say is, there are 2 conjugations in Greek. There's the thematic conjugation that uses a theme vowel or connecting vowel. And there's the athematic, the conjugation that doesn't use a connecting vowel, and the lexical forms in mu iota. So let's look at a couple of forms, and you'll see that it's not that big of a deal. There's a verb called didomi. You see it in the header on the slide. Didomi. It means I give. And although you may not see it immediately, the stem is da. Delta with an O-class vowel, either an omicron or an omega. Okay, so the root da means I give. And let's look at these forms. It's obviously a me verb. Its lexical form is didomi. But just to show you that it's not that different, especially outside the present active, dosete. What's that? Right, I'm hearing it whispered. It has to be a future, right? You have the stem, you have the sigma, a connecting vowel and a te, so that's a second person plural, future active indicative. You will give. Perfectly regular, isn't it? Dedokete. Right, second person plural, perfect, no big deal. Reduplication with an epsilon, your ka, tense formative, normal endings, no big deals. Edokamin. Something's a little different there. But what can you tell me for sure that you know about edokamin? Okay, it's a first person plural, same ending. It's got an augment, I heard someone say. So it's an aorist. At least the assumption is that it's an aorist. What's odd about the form? It has a kappa. If that kappa were a sigma, you would know it's an aorist. Okay, this is one of the 5 rules on me verbs. Most me verbs have what are called kappa aorists. In other words, instead of using sa, they use ka in the aorist. But that's not a big deal. Why? Why are you not going to confuse that with the perfect? Good. Yeah, edokamin, it looks like an aorist. It is an aorist. Me verbs use kappa aorist. Not going to be confused with the perfects because there's no reduplication. Didomen. Yeah, this will be a little harder, except that you know the lexical form is didomi. Guess what happens to me verbs in the present? Only in the present. They reduplicate their initial letter, as if it's a perfect, but that reduplicated letter is separated with an iota, not an epsilon. So when you see the lexical form, in other words, with the reduplication with the iota, you know you're in the present tense system. Notice something else happened. Yeah, the vowel shortened, didn't it? It's been do elsewhere, even in the present active singular, did do me, but in the present active plural, it shortens. Now, some people have you memorize when these vowels are going to be long and when they're going to be short. I really don't care. I just know that the root for I give ends in either omicron or omega, and there's always enough clues elsewhere in the word to tell me what it is. So I don't really care whether it's an omega or an omicron. It's an O-class vowel. Didomen has to be present. Edidus, it's a little trickier, but you have two indications. What tense is that? And it's imperfect, isn't it? You have the did, you have the reduplication with the iota, so you know you're in the present tense system, but you have an augment, so it has to be imperfect, and sigma is your second person singular ending, and there's been a contraction. So there's your imperfect. Okay, so there are a few things that are different here, aren't there? In the aorist, you have kappa aorist. In the present, you have reduplication with the iota. You have fluctuating vowels in terms of their length. But those are all things you can handle. And recognize that most of the oddities occur in the present active. Outside of that part of the system, these things are very easy to recognize if you know the root. And that's the key. If you saw dedokate, if you don't know the root is da, you're not going to figure out what that is. So as you've been doing with all the other verbs, it's really important in me verbs to learn not only the lexical form, but its root. If you do that, these things are pretty straightforward. You know, that's a lot for one slide, but that's almost everything that's in the chapter. All right? Let me just run through quickly the 5 rules. There's only really one more thing you have to learn. Let me run through the 5 rules just so you can see how these things work. Rule 1 on me verbs is that they reduplicate in the present with the iota. The root is da. It reduplicates with the iota only in the present system, did da, and you end up with dido me. But that means outside, like in the future, outside the present system, everything is regular. As long as you've learned that all the different tenses are formed from the root, not from the present tense stem. And again, the really important thing here is to learn the roots. Rule 2, verbs in the thematic conjugation, or me verbs, don't have a connecting vowel. They don't have a connecting vowel because the roots all end in a vowel. So you may not notice right up front that there's no connecting vowel because of the final stem vowel, but that's where the name of the conjugation comes from. You know, Greek puts an alpha in front of a word to negate it, called an alpha privative. So thematic, athematic. No big deal though, okay? Here's the only other additional thing that you will need to memorize. Rule 3 is that me verbs use some alternate personal endings in the present active. Outside of the present active system, it's all blissfully regular. And you can see in red the 3 new endings. Now, they're not that hard to learn because in the first person singular, you'll memorize the lexical forms as dido me. So if you see the mu iota, you know it's first person singular. That's no big deal. Then you have didos, second singular, didosi with the new movable. That's the one you have to be careful of because you may think that this is a third plural or some sort of dative or something. But the sigma iota with the new movable is the one ending third singular you'll have to learn. And if you notice, Greek verbs really like third singulars. A lot of them. And you get into the plural, didomen, you see the vowel shortens, but big deal. Didate, didoasi with a new movable. That's your other new ending. But you've already seen that in the perfect system, haven't you? Kasi. So the alpha sigma iota is not brand new for you. So there are 3 new endings. It's the third singular that you have to really be careful to learn. Me verbs are unbelievably regular. The problem is that if you get exposed to the present active, where most of the changes are, And if you're used to thinking of the other tenses as being formed from the present tense and not from the root, these things are miserable to learn. But if you go from the root, they're regular, that vowel is going to be there, and the root is always, almost always, clearly visible in the present tense system. Rule number 4 is the stem vowel changes the length. As far as I'm concerned, it's not a big deal. Long or short, I don't care what it is. But that vowel will fluctuate. And rule number 5, most me verbs used kappa aorists. But again, there's not going to be a reduplication, and so these things shouldn't be a problem. In terms of the endings, they're all blissfully regular. What that means now, though, is that when you see the kappa, you can't automatically assume it's a perfect. You've got to look at the root, look for reduplication. Okay, now that you've seen the rules, just real quickly again, let's look at a couple of forms just to get it into your head. Dosamen, tense, future, right? There's the delta O-class vowel, sigma, no problems, you're in a regular future. Edidate, what tense? Right, imperfect. You have an augment and a reduplication within the iota. Can't be anything else. Edokan, aorist. Augment, kappa aorist. Didos, present, reduplication within the iota. And dedokan, perfect. And perfect. Reduplication with an epsilon, and there's the kappa in the perfect. You can do it. 5 rules, but see, this is why we took the little harder route at the beginning of the book. Instead of just, well, I'll just memorize the paradigm. It's why I've been pushing you so hard to know how these things go together. If you weren't used to doing that, and we hit me verbs, you have 330 more forms to memorize. All right, you're welcome.